gives me considerable pleasure today to be able to engage Clarence Glacken in a dialogue. Professor Glacken is Emeritus Professor of Geography here at Berkeley. I have very clear and fond memories of my first years here at Berkeley when I had an office next door to you, Clarence, and would periodically come in to talk informally with you about books I was reading or you were reading. And I was very much impressed then, and still am now, with the frequency with which you both would refer to your first mentor, Professor Taggart, and to your early years in Sacramento. Perhaps we might just start first talking about those years in Sacramento, if that's appropriate, in terms of how you, from this vantage point, feel they influenced your intellectual development and the development of your interests.
Well, thank you, Allan. I was born in Sacramento, and both my parents were born in Sacramento, and so I had very firm roots in there. I grew up as a boy in which Sacramento was closely identified, of course, with the Transcontinental Railroad, and was very closely identified with gold and with Sutter and Marshall. And at that time, Sacramento wasn't the megalopolis that it is today. It was, I don't remember what the exact population was, but it perhaps was 40 or 50,000, and of course you didn't have these, the suburban areas and things of this kind. And so I went through elementary school there, and I went through junior college in Sacramento. And I think it was in elementary school that I first got my very strong interest in geography, because one of our teachers, in addition to having spelling matches, also had geography matches. And so we stood up opposite one another, and she would reel off certain names, place names, and we were supposed to be able to point them out on the map. And I can remember to this day, I don't know how many years it's been since, my triumph in being able to point out where the Gulf of Carpentaria was. And in addition to those early interests in place names, and I've never been a geographer that looked down my nose at people who knew where places were, especially Americans. Many Americans don't know whether India is northeast, southwest, or of Siberia. And so I've always had a respect for place names and where places were. A second aspect of this thing was that as a boy, and this sort of ended when I was about 13, I was an ardent stamp collector. My grandfather started me on this. And I was particularly enchanted with many of these colonial issues, the French colonial issues especially, of Reunion and Martinique and Equatorial Africa, with all these marvelous scenes on them. And I became very well acquainted with many of the countries of the world through these stamps that I was collecting, and which I would go out on my bike in the afternoons or after dinner or after my paper route and exchange these stamps with my friends. And then gradually I lost this interest, unfortunately, because I guess stamp collecting is now pretty rewarding financially. But at any rate, as I went on, I went through high school and junior college. And at junior college, I met a young instructor who had just come from Cal here. And he was he had got his master's in English. And his name was John Harold Swan, and I'll never forget him. He introduced me to some of Yeats's poetry and things of this sort. I never took a course from him, and I looked upon him as quite a bit of an older man. And as a matter of fact, he wasn't that much older than I was. I was about 17, and I suppose he was an advanced age of 25 or 24, 25. And in my end of my sophomore year at the Sacramento Junior College, he says to me, he says, when you go down to Berkeley, you take a course from Professor Taggart. Well, I'd never heard of Professor Taggart, and I'd never heard of anything about what he taught or anything else. But I had a great deal of respect for what Swan said, and so I took this course. It was a freshman course. It was given in 211-wheeler, as I remember it. It was given on Tuesdays from about 11 to 12. and it was on the idea of progress. It was a whole year's course on the idea of progress, and he had compiled a series of readings on this subject, and actually it was far more than that, because he advanced the idea, and I think correctly, that ideas of progress and of perfectibility didn't exist in the ancient world. So that in essence what it was a history of theories of social change from the ancient world to the present. Well, this opened up a world to me that I had no idea of, this whole vast world of intellectual history. And there are many people in the academic world who are quite expert and in the things they do, who are obviously competent to teach the sort of things they teach. But there are other people who transcend this, and Taggart was one of them. I think he was one of the great scholars that the university here had produced, and I still think his theory of history is one of the very, very finest analyses of history, despite all that's written about history since he published the theory of history in 1925, I believe it was, by the Yale University Press. And so from him, I got this idea of the tremendous importance of intellectual history and the history of ideas. And this, he was teaching this course long before Lovejoy wrote The Great Chain of Being. And he had a great deal of interest in this whole subject. And in addition, he was a man of extraordinary capacity in lecturing and very enthusiastic. And he could work himself up into all sorts of emotional situations about certain people. For example, he absolutely despised Rousseau. And so every time he came to Rousseau, why, he really became very explosive. But he was the sort of man who could make you feel and think and understand the vastness of intellectual history. And I've always been grateful to him because, for this reason, that at a very early age, I was only 18 at the time, and I was taking this freshman course as a junior. At a very early age, I was introduced to excellence, to what I thought was real excellence. And it was, there are few enough people in the world that have this surpassing excellence, that went over their fields into other things. And that is, I've been very grateful to him ever since. At that time, he was a man, a very imposing man, a very impressive-looking man. He was about 58, I guess, at that time.
So basically, it was through a chance contact at junior college that led you to look into the courses that Taggart was offering, and this developed into a continuing relationship, or at least you continued in the field of what was then called social institutions?
Yes, that was the social institutions. It was a department here that preceded the present sociology department. He was death on sociology, Taggart was, and he was very much, it was called the social institutions department. I think it was, I forgot which president had given him this special department because he didn't get along apparently very well with the other departments that he'd been in. And as I look back on it, what really strikes me about this, as a junior when I came here, I was so impressed by his work and by what he had to give that I completely ignored three famous professors here on the campus, one of whom was Carl Sauer. I had no courses from Carl Sauer when I was a student here, and I had heard of him, but I had made no attempt to take a course in geography. I'm not trying to deprecate. All I'm trying to say is that I was so absorbed, you see, in what I thought Taggart had to say that nothing else interested me very much, because the first year I had been a political science major, then I changed over. And the other two that I ignored were Kroeber and Lowy. And Kroeber was, at that time, as I remember, probably the height of his powers, and so was Lowy. Lowy had just finished, or I think Lowy at about that time had written his history of ethnological theories. And it was only, I never really met Kroeber, but it was later on in life I met Lowy, and he was a very, very gentle man and a very, very charming person to be with. But those three people I had very little, no contact with when I was a student here.
You actually continued on and took a master's degree in social institutions.
Yes, I did, and I wrote examinations for this rather than a thesis, and I took it under a woman who I very much respected. She died only a couple years ago, Margaret Hodgin. She was the age of 85 or so. As a matter of fact, I was one of the ones that wrote the obituary for her for the university publications. And I met her as a young man, and this friendship continued throughout life. And Margaret Hodgin gave a year's course on the history of social theory and the history of the social sciences. And she elaborated on many of the things that Tegger had done, but went much farther into it. And I got insights into the history of sociology, the history of anthropology, and the history of geography. For example, she brought up some of the early writings of the environmental determinists, some of the earlier things like Hippocrates, and later on with Montesquieu. She was acquainted with the possibilists at the time, and I can remember hearing her lecture about Vidal de la Blache and other people like that. And so I got this feeling of, say, geographical thought as part of this wider area of the history of social thought in general. And I've been very grateful to her, too.
When you finished your master's degree here, you found yourself basically in the beginning of the Depression, and you didn't pursue your academic training further at that point, but became involved in a string of government jobs. Was this conscious choice, or the conditions of the times, or?
Well, I would say it was the conditions of the times. It was almost unheard of to get well, maybe not unheard of, it was rare to get a fellowship to study abroad, for example. And when I got my master's, it was, that was at the end of, it was 32, so here was the end of the Hoover administration, and the first Roosevelt administration had not yet gone into power, of course. So there didn't seem to be very little opportunity in the academic field for me, although I did try unsuccessfully to get some scholarships to various universities. And so that I went into various forms of work, almost all concerned with various aspects of the New Deal relief programs. I worked for the state and the state and federal relief administration, and I was district supervisor in certain counties here in California, the administration of relief. And I also worked for the Farm Security Administration, because at that time it had quite a few plans for migratory labor camps going all the way from Brawley up to Marysville and Yuba City. And so as an academic, I'm somewhat aberrant in the sense that I didn't get my PhD and start out as an assistant professor and go on. There was over a 10-year lapse between the time that I got my MA and the time I got my PhD. No, wait a minute, not 10 years, it was 20 years, because I didn't get my PhD until 1952. And so that counted in that period, a period I was drafted in the Army in World War II, and I served 6 years in the Army, and I started out as a draftee, and then I later became an officer and was in the civil administration and military government of Korea when I was finally released. And before that, I had gone for 2 years at the University of Chicago and studied Japanese, and was able to speak fairly well the Japanese language, but I never had the skill to read it, because that's an extraordinarily difficult language to read. That paid off in a way, because after I got my degree, I did this village study in Okinawa. I lived several months in these three villages, and I wrote this little book called The Great Lu Chu, which was studies in Okinawan village life, which appeared 2 or 3 years after I came here, as when Mr. Sauer asked me to join the staff.
this period when you were studying Japanese at Chicago, was this in connection with your military service, or had you independently
No, I was an Army officer at the time, and I had applied, and I was chosen. I don't know why. You never know why you're chosen in the Army. And perhaps one of the reasons was that when I was in my late 20s, I decided, you see, I'd grown up in Sacramento, what I regarded as a highly provincial place. And I had this great yen to travel. And I had, you wouldn't believe it. I guess everybody here in this room is so young they wouldn't believe it. But when I was 21, I had never visited Los Angeles. Now, of course, Los Angeles was about over 450 miles from Sacramento, but still, but that was in the age before the freeways, and it was the age of the Model A and the Model T, and so it wasn't so amazing as it would be now. And so I had decided at that time that I would drop everything, and I took this trip around the world on my own money for 11 months in 1937, from about February to about December. And so I think that trip probably had something to do with my selection to train in the Japanese, because I had visited Japan and China and what was then Indochina, was now Vietnam, and I had visited these, and I'd always had this tremendous interest in the Far East, being from California, and the university here very, very early had courses in Far Eastern international relations and things of this sort, so that I had that interest, and so I continued on with that.
What is it exactly that happened at the end of your military service that resulted in your going on to do PhD work in geography at Johns Hopkins, and, say, doing work in geography rather than in intellectual history or the history of ideas?
Well, that's a very difficult question to piece together, because I'm not quite sure whether my memory is exact on all these things or not. After I got out of the Army, I had been married for the second time. My first wife had died, and I had the two children, and I had a job in Washington with the Veterans Administration. It was a job concerned with research on the characteristics of veterans in various educational programs. And also I was concerned with analyzing proposed legislation for veterans. But I decided that those things were very uncertain, and I didn't want to return to the sort of things I had gone, that I had before I became, that is, before I was drafted into the Army. So that I had talked around a great deal, and then the Bowman School at that time was apparently had been a new departure in schools of geography. They had several people, including Carter and Penrose, who was in economics, and someone had recommended that I look into that, which I did, and I decided at that age, to go back and to get my degree. Another thing that had influenced me a great deal was that in my own work before being drafted into the Army, I had a lot of this work was in country that Steinbeck made famous, that is the San Joaquin Valley, the Dust Bowl experiences and things of this kind. And also I had been very much interested in these problems of soil erosion that had been published and had been publicized before the Second World War, at least toward the end of the 30s. And then another thing that had an influence on me was that I had a very good friend that I met through my wife. She was his secretary in one of the government agencies at the time. His name was William Boat, and he made he wrote a very famous book at the time. It was called The Road to Survival. And if you read the book now, you wonder why everybody was so excited, as if everybody had made all these discoveries in the 60s, because he had said perhaps almost all these things that had been said in the 60s. And I was very much impressed by him as a person and as a scientist, although he had never had, I don't think he had ever gone on for a doctorate or anything of this sort. And so I became very much interested in this whole question of population and resources and soil erosion. And another thing that interested me was right after World War II, There was the United Nations held an international conference on the utilization of resources. I've forgotten the exact title. And one of the volumes was on the plenary sessions, which interested me a great deal. I was not, of course, a participant myself, but I read many of these things, and it was very interesting to me that for political reasons at that time, they couldn't very much discuss population questions. And so when I went to Hopkins, I decided I would like to write a thesis on these, on these various ideas as they developed in soils and in ecology and population theory and things of this sort. And this is what I did. And so that brings me up to the end of that period. And then right after that, because I should say that this program in the University of Chicago was under the auspices of the anthropology department, and I had been recommended by one of the person in charge there to become a member of this team of mostly of anthropologists who would make an ethnographic studies of the Ryukyu Islands in hope that many of these things could be written about and set down before they disappeared. And so right after I got my degree, I went over to Okinawa and spent this time in those villages.
And from there you came here to Berkeley?
From there I came to Berkeley, and I never knew quite whether I was hired or not. Then Mr. Sauer said to me one morning, well, you think you'd like to teach here? And I said yes, and I didn't realize that that meant I was hired.
Well, how did you encounter Sauer?
I had called on him when on my way to Okinawa. That is, my wife and children came out here. California was our home. And while I was in Okinawa, they decided to stay here, and I called on Mr. Sauer on my way out. And then I wrote him, I called on him 2 or 3 times, and then I called on him when I returned, and gradually we became friendly, and he finally asked me whether I'd like to stay on, and here I am.
Do you have any idea of what his motivations may have been, your field experience in Japan, or your interest in the history of ideas and your previous connections with Taggart, or something else?
I have no real notion. I must just say I admired him very much for one thing he subsequently told me many, many years later, and that is, I hope I'm not telling tales out of school here, but that he and Taggart feuded. And apparently over the fact that Taggart had the tendency to take out thousands of books from the library and put them in the seminar room. And from what Mr. Sauer had told me, he had included volume after volume of the Geographical Review and things of this sort. And so apparently Sauer finally pried them loose and got them within the geography department. And so I would expect that he would have been somewhat prejudiced against somebody who was an admirer of Taggart and a student, but he just sort of said that rather humorously a few years later, and I never realized until later what this situation had been.
Well, up to this time, we've really been talking about, in some measure, the road that led you to Berkeley. I'd like to explore another related road in a little bit more detail. Your book, Traces on the Rhodian Shore, is one of those rare things, a scholarly work that becomes a classic in its own time in many disciplines. And it was obviously a work of that involved a tremendous number of years. I remember when I first came here getting the impression that you had been working on that for at least a decade. At what point did you decide to make such a tremendous commitment of time and effort to deal with a very ambitious topic of the history of ideas concerning nature and culture?
Well, that again is a very difficult question to answer, because the notion of a history of ideas had never long departed from my consciousness. And when I first thought of it, I thought of it in a very simple way, and I thought of it the way it had developed traditionally, not only in geographical literature, but also in the literature of sociology and political science and things of that sort. That is the literature of environmental determinism, which had been a pretty well tilled field by historians. And then as I went along, suddenly occurred to me, well, if you had this history of ideas of environmental determinism, the influence of climate and relief and all of those things, you certainly must have a history of ideas about the opposite point of view. That is the history of conceptions or interpretations of the way human beings themselves have transformed the earth. Instead of being influenced by it, they have transformed it. And I must admit that one of the books that set me thinking about this from a historical point of view was Marsh's Man and Nature, because Marsh had written humorously that he was writing a book to show that whereas all the geographers thought that nature molded man, man in fact molded the earth. And so this set me on this second idea, this notion of the human beings as geological agents or geographical agents. And then I pushed this back farther and farther back, and pretty soon I found myself with Sophocles and with Plato's Critias and all of those things, and gradually worked back up again. And that's the way I discovered Buffon, who I became a great admirer of Buffon because in the epochs of nature, in the seventh epoch, it's the epoch in which human beings also participate in the actual structure and transformation of the earth. And so I had those two ideas, and then I can never understand why I was so dense about all this matter. And it finally occurred to me that I was leaving out something extremely important and is even more inexcusable, because through Taggart and others, I had been well aware of the tremendous importance of teleological thinking in the history of Western thought. But as I gradually went along, it finally occurred to me, well, you're leaving out perhaps the most fundamental idea of all from a historical point of view, and that is the idea that we live on a planet that has been purposely designed for human beings. In other words, it's a teleological view of nature. It's been called all sorts of things: ideas of final causes, ideas of teleology, ideas of God's design in nature, and things of this sort. Well, this set me on a merry chase, and I started with the ancients, and of course the early church fathers had a tremendous amount to say about this, finding evidences of God in the creation, so this became the third idea that I gradually worked out. And it wasn't a question of sitting down at the beginning and making nice, comfortable outlines and following them through. It was more a question of following my nose.
So this was a project that, as it were, grew with time. I mean, when you started, you didn't have any idea that you would wind up with something as broad and deep as what you did do. You start off with a relatively narrow question, and
I did, and furthermore, I started off with this book I wrote. I had originally envisaged it as a rather long footnote to my doctor's thesis. My doctor's thesis, thank God, was never published. But what I wanted to do was to redo the doctoral thesis and have this rather long footnote of this, and so this footnote turned into several hundred pages.
But by the time I came here, you were teaching a number of courses, both at the undergraduate and seminar level, that in one way or another related to the themes of traces. At what point did Sauer enable or permit you to start teaching in this direction? Or were you teaching in this area from the very outset?
Well, Sauer was wonderful in that respect. He never really told you what to teach. And when the first year I was here, he said, well, you can teach this course on the history of ideas, which I did. And the first year also that I was here, they asked me if I would teach a course, which I did, on the geography of China, Japan, Korea, and the Ryukyus, and I taught that for several years. This was very valuable in a way because if you stick to one tradition, to the Western civilization tradition, you unconsciously become very limited. And so I had a fair working knowledge of the ethnography of China, Japan, and Korea, and of my own personal experience living in these villages. So I felt I had some way of having a broader perspective than I would have had I not had done this. And the same thing was true with later on, curiously enough. I taught the courses in Northwestern Europe and the Mediterranean, and I especially enjoyed the Mediterranean course because here is this area, like China, an area of very, very long human settlement, and one could see here the results of all of this environmental change through millennia brought about by human settlement. And so Sauer always gave me, and other members of the staff too, you must remember that that time was an extremely small department. There were 3 or 4 of us. I don't think we had more than 7 or 8 majors and maybe a few more graduate students. And our classes weren't very large, but and many times these courses sort of helped me out in seeing a broader view than I would have had otherwise.
During the evolution of traces, were you influenced in any way by the various contacts you had here on campus? I, again, was from the outset rather impressed with the range of contacts you had with people in sociology, history, and so on.
Well, I received a great deal of help. In a sense, there's a great deal of generosity, you know, in the academic world, despite all the criticisms that have been made of it. And sometimes people, even though they're very busy, will read your things. And I had friends in the classics department, I had friends in history and in sociology who did read the pertinent parts of these various ideas, of these various chapters dealing with those things. And the suggestions they had to make were extremely helpful. When one undertakes a subject like this, it's just full of pitfalls everywhere you turn. You can make mistakes that you don't even realize that there is the possibility of making an error. And very often you need people to help you out or to say, well, here you just missed it completely, or you mistranslated this, or things of this sort. And so I'm very grateful to people like that who helped me.
For the last few years, you've been devoting your time to, as it were, writing a sequel to Traces, dealing with the same themes on through the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, a great amount of time has transpired since you first started working on Traces, and I wonder if you have any conscious sense of how working from a different vantage point, a different setting now, influences how you're viewing the development of ideas in the past, the meaning that you are imposing on the past.
I'm not quite sure I could answer that in a way. In the first place, I couldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I hadn't done the other, because I guess one of my favorite figures of speech is dear old Caesar, because I can remember Caesar from my high school days. He was always in the middle of things, in medias res. If I were started out doing what I'm doing now, I would be like Caesar, because I wouldn't know what went before. And so now, from this vantage point of all this year's work before, if I see an expression or something of this sort, I know it isn't a bit of rhetoric. I know that I'm not afflicted with precursoritis, in the sense I don't try to find who influenced who and who and who all the way back, so that it turns out that nobody ever is original. I don't mean it in that sense, but there is this great substratum of thought that I've been able to build on because of my previous studies. And in this part that I've been working on now for quite a while, on the subjective and aesthetic and emotional reactions to nature in the latter part of the 18th and early part of the 19th century, I would be unable to do without this background of these other ideas, because if you pick up a letter of Byron, or if you pick up Scott's Lady of the Lake, or whatever it happens to be, you see things that you wouldn't have seen if I hadn't had this preparation before. And so that becomes very, very exciting in many ways, to feel sort of comfortable in the literature in which you're dealing. And this new work that I've been working on, in a sense, it's a continuation, except for this one I just mentioned. This is something extra, because you do have this tremendous, well, let me put it this way, even today you will find statements of people that the Romantic movement Romanticism was just being balmy and loony. As a matter of fact, I believe that the Romantic period was one of the great creative periods in modern Western thought, in literature, and especially in literature and music and art. Furthermore, the Romantic movement is regarding the so-called Romantic movement, regarding its attitudes toward nature, has a tremendous range. That is, it's not one of all of this stuff of swooning and sighing at moonlight and things of this sort. There's a lot more to it than that. And so I've become very much impressed by many of the things, not only the English poets that I hadn't read since I was a teenager, and also many of the French and the Germans as well. And so it's been a rich experience for me.
Our time is beginning to run out here, and perhaps we ought to try and come full cycle by asking you a somewhat leading question, and that is that we started off in some measure talking about the influence that Teggett had on you, and I would like to know what you feel is the general place in geography today, in the training of graduate students, of gaining some appreciation of the history of social change in particular.
Well, I think it's extremely important for several different reasons, and since the time is running short, I won't give you a catalog of them. But the two reasons especially that strike me, first is that one thing about the history of thought, it teaches you first humility. Some people come up with ideas that they think are new, and it turns out they're 2,500 years old. The second thing is that it can give you a certain confidence in being sure-footed in what you're dealing with. And I don't mean just these narrow kinds of writings where you have a textbook, say, and then the first chapter is on the history of the subject. These are valuable enough, but what I mean is a broad background in the leading ideas that have, say, dominated social thought and social theory since the ancient world. And I think geographers could profit a great deal by this. I know the curricula are crowded and can't teach everything, and history of ideas is certainly not everybody's cup of tea. Still, I think that even an introduction to it, or at least an awareness of the existence of this whole field, in addition to the history of science, is invaluable. Even though persons themselves may not have the opportunity or the desire to go into it in a serious way, the mere knowledge of the existence of this, that all ideas have a history, is, I think, a good step forward.
Well, with that closing observation, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to engage in this dialogue. Thank you, Clarence.
Well, thank you.